He left the letter on the porch like he couldn't bear to hand it to me. The ink still wet, smearing beneath my thumb as if the words were trying to run away. The morning air was cold enough to sting, but not enough to explain the way my hands shook. By the time I reached the second line, I could already tell he'd been holding a truth I was never meant to read. My name is Lorraine Hayes, 48 years old, born and raised in a quiet corner of southern Georgia, where porches creak louder than people speak. I've known my husband Charles since we were teenagers, the kind of man who kept his voice soft and his secrets softer. For years, our house sat in a hush that felt peaceful, until the morning I found that letter tucked beneath a chipped ceramic mug he knew I used every Sunday. The ink was fresh, the paper cold, and something in the air told me life had just shifted in a way I couldn't yet understand. The light was thin that morning, the kind that settles quiet over everything before the world decides what kind of day it wants to be. I stepped onto the porch with my shawl still wrapped tight around my shoulders, the boards damp beneath my feet. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but it left behind a shine that made the whole yard look like it had been washed clean. That was when I saw it, a single envelope resting against the wicker chair as if the wind had placed it there with careful hands. But the wind didn't know my name in that neat little curl on the paper. Charles did. And even before I bent down, even before the cold reached my fingers, something in my chest whispered that the morning had already changed. The ink wasn't dry. I could see the slight shine along the curve of the L, like it had been written in a hurry, or maybe with a trembling hand. Charles never wrote fast. His letters, even grocery lists, always looked like he was afraid of rushing through a thought. But this felt like it had come from a place he didn't want to stay in too long. The envelope was still warm, too, faintly, as if his hand had been holding it just moments before. Standing there with the sky still soft and the last of the rain sliding off the porch rail, I knew he had been close. Maybe close enough to hear the kettle warming, close enough to hear me clearing my throat the way I do when I'm half awake, close enough to knock, but choosing not to. Inside the envelope, the first lines met me with a weight I didn't expect. The words weren't sharp or angry. They didn't feel like an explanation or an apology. They felt like something quieter, heavier. A confession without the word itself. I only read half a sentence before my eyes stopped moving. It wasn't the content. It was the feeling of reading something meant for after. After what? I didn't know. But the porch felt too open for it, the sky too exposed, so I held the letter against my chest for a moment, letting the morning chill settle around me before turning back toward the house. Walking inside didn't ease the feeling. The air felt different somehow, as if the walls had been listening. The scent of coffee drifted through the kitchen, faint and familiar, but even that didn't ground me. I kept thinking about him standing outside, the rain still fresh, his shoes on that wet porch. I imagined his hand hesitating before letting go of the envelope. I imagined him glancing at our bedroom window, maybe checking if he'd woken me, maybe hoping he hadn't. Charles had never been the type to slip away quietly. He was the kind that breathed too loud when he was nervous, who paced the hallway even when he didn't have the words for what was on his mind. Yet he left a letter like someone who had rehearsed it. I walked into the kitchen, placing the envelope gently on the table, as if it could bruise. The sounds of the house settled around me, the low hum of the refrigerator, the soft drip of the faucet, the way the floor creaked beneath my steps, like it was remembering each moment from years before. My hands rested on the back of a chair as I looked at the letter, still unopened. I didn't want to read it. Not yet. Not while the morning was still finding its shape. I needed to sit with the fact that he had been here, that he had chosen the porch, that he had chosen paper instead of his voice. The more I stared at it, the more I felt something twisting beneath my ribs. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A quiet recognition that whatever was inside those folded lines might shift the way I saw the past few months, maybe the past few years. Charles had been distant lately, moving around the house like someone trying not to disturb dust. His smiles never made it to his eyes. His silences were longer, stretched thin like something was pulling at him. But he still slept on his side of the bed, still placed his keys in the same bowl by the door, still kissed my cheek each night, even if the warmth didn't linger. I picked up the envelope again, tracing the shaky handwriting. It wasn't just the letters themselves that told me something was wrong. It was the pressure. Light, almost uncertain, like he didn't trust his own hand. There had been nights when I woke to him sitting at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if it might rise up and speak to him. I'd ask if he was all right. He always said yes, always said he just couldn't sleep. But the shadows under his eyes grew deeper, and his shoulders seemed to carry something I couldn't name. I sat down slowly, the chair groaning the way old furniture does when it's been part of too many conversations. The letter stayed in my hands, still unopened. I didn't rush. I let the moment sit with me. The cold from the porch was still lingering in my skin, and I could feel the dampness in my slippers. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to decide whether to unfold the truth waiting inside that paper. Why hadn't he knocked on the door? The question circled through my mind like a slow-moving storm. It wasn't like him to leave something unsaid. Even in our hardest moments, he always faced me. Sometimes with trembling words, sometimes with silence that carried its own language, but always with presence. Leaving a letter outside that felt like a man stepping out of himself, or stepping away from something he wasn't ready to face. The edge of the page brushed my thumb, and for a moment I almost opened it. But something stopped me. Not fear, not denial, just a knowing. A quiet understanding that once I read his words, whatever life we had before sunrise would not be the same after. So I placed the letter back on the table, smoothing it gently, letting the morning settle around me like a thin blanket. Outside, the rain clouds were drifting away, leaving streaks of pale blue along the sky. The world was waking, stretching, unfolding, but inside, everything felt suspended. I sat there, hands resting in my lap, listening to the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, and somewhere in that slow rhythm, I felt the weight of his absence settle into the room beside me. Not loud, not harsh, just present enough to whisper that whatever came next would not be simple. I looked at the envelope one last time, the ink still holding its faint shine, and in that quiet I felt something shift inside me, as gentle and unsettling as a cold morning breeze against the skin. The day had only just begun, but already the truth was waiting. The kitchen was still dim when I stepped back inside, the kind of half-light that makes everything look softer than it really is. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the pantry door, steady and slow, like it was counting the moments between one truth and the next. My eyes landed on the sink before anything else. Charles's mug, the chipped one with the tiny blue line near the handle. It sat there with a ring of coffee drying along the rim, the way it always did on mornings when something weighed on him. Seeing it there, abandoned mid-sip, made the air shift around me, colder somehow, as if the house was trying to warn me before I had the chance to breathe properly. I moved toward it without thinking, my slippers brushing softly across the floor. The mug was tilted just enough to show the swirl of brown at the bottom, unfinished, untouched after that last swallow. He never left coffee behind, not even on the days when his back hurt too much to sit straight, not even on the mornings when he woke before me and tried not to make noise. That small detail alone made my chest feel as if something inside it had gone heavy, sinking inch by inch. It wasn't the coffee. It wasn't the mug. It was the stillness they left behind. The walls felt tighter than usual, like the house had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. I reached for the letter on the table, the paper still, cool from the morning air. I unfolded it slowly, the crease resisting the way paper does when it wasn't meant to be opened more than once. My eyes moved over the words, familiar yet not, written in the hand I had known for more than half my life. But this version of his handwriting, this tremble in the strokes, felt like it belonged to a man standing in the dark with thoughts too loud to keep inside his head. There was a smear near the bottom of the page, a soft blur where one letter bled into another, as if water had touched it. Rain, maybe, or a tear he wouldn't have admitted to. I traced the smear lightly with my thumb. The ink felt dry, but I could almost see it fresh again, spreading in real time while he stood out there under the last of the night rain. That simple blur held more weight than the sentence it interrupted, and I felt my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected, the kind of tightening that comes when you understand something too quickly and too well. I lowered the letter and rested my hands on the edge of the counter, letting the cool surface ground me. The memories came slow at first, then all at once. Quiet arguments whispered in hallways, long pauses at dinner where the sound of chewing felt louder than the words we weren't saying, the way he'd rub his brow with his thumb and forefinger when he didn't want to explain himself. None of it was dramatic, nothing you could point to as the cause of anything, but quiet can bruise just as deep as shouting, maybe deeper, because you start to mistake silence for peace. And by the time you realize the difference, the cracks have already widened. I thought of the night 3 weeks ago when he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching me fold laundry. He opened his mouth like he had something to say, then closed it, just nodded and walked away. I didn't follow him, didn't ask. That moment came back to me now with a sting I wasn't ready for. Maybe this letter started that night. Maybe he'd been writing it in his mind every evening since, line by hesitant line, while the space between us stretched quietly like old seams giving out. I picked up the mug, turning it in my hands. The warmth had long faded, but the stain still clung to the inside like a ghost of his breath. I held it the way he did on cold mornings, cradling it between both palms. I imagined him doing the same earlier, alone in the dark kitchen before dawn. Maybe the rain was tapping the window. Maybe he was thinking too hard, the kind of thinking that makes a man feel older than he is. If he stood in the same spot I was standing now, then he must have looked out into that quiet yard, at the wet porch, at the soft edges of the morning just beginning. And something in that moment must have told him he couldn't stay. I set the mug gently back into the sink, careful not to make a sound. The house felt like it would flinch at the slightest noise. I kept glancing toward the doorway, half expecting him to walk in, rubbing his eyes, asking why I was up so early. But the doorway stayed empty. The silence kept stretching. My breath made the only movement in the room. I went back to the letter, reading the first few lines again, slower this time. The words didn't give reasons. They didn't ask for understanding. They simply acknowledged something he hadn't said out loud, something he didn't know how to bring into the light with his own voice. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers, not from wind, not from the room, but from me. I sat down at the table, letting the chair groan beneath me, the old wood speaking where I couldn't. I wondered if he wrote it while sitting right here, the pen shaking, the rain hitting the porch roof in that steady rhythm that makes a person feel smaller than they want to admit. Maybe he looked at the mug afterward, the coffee cooling faster than his resolve. Maybe he stared at the doorway to our bedroom, knowing he should come to me, knowing he couldn't. That image pressed itself against me like a weight I couldn't shift. What pushed him? That question settled into my chest like a stone. It wasn't just the letter. It wasn't just the unfinished coffee. It was the timing. After all these years, why now? Why before sunrise? Why leave without a sound when every part of our life had been built on shared mornings? The letter lay flat on the table, the smear catching the light in a way that made it look wet again. I reached for it, then stopped. Something told me not to reread it. Not yet. The truth inside it wasn't going anywhere. It would sit there until I was ready to let it change something. So I folded it slowly, smoothing the crease, and placed it beside the salt shaker, as if it belonged there among familiar things. Outside, the sky was brightening, brushing the kitchen walls with a soft gold. I watched the light creep across the floorboards, patient and indifferent. The house felt like it was waiting for me to decide what to feel, but all I could do was sit there with the quiet, with the mug in the sink, with the letter he couldn't speak out loud. And in that stillness, I realized the morning wasn't moving forward. Not yet. It was paused, holding its breath right along with me, suspended between what I knew and what I didn't. The truth was somewhere in that space, waiting for me to lift it. But for now, all I could do was sit in the quiet he left behind. The bedroom was still washed in that pale morning light when I walked in, the kind that slips through the curtains in thin, wandering lines. It made everything look softer than it felt. The bed was still unmade from the night before, the sheets folded and creased where his body had been. I stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the quiet that pressed against the walls like a second layer of air. Something about the room felt unfamiliar in its own skin, as if it had woken before I did and learned a truth I wasn't ready for. I moved toward the closet, my hand brushing the door as I pulled it open. The scent of cedar drifted out, warm and steady, the way it always did. His jackets lined the left side, neat and evenly spaced, except one, the tan one he wore on early morning drives, the one with the loose thread on the collar he never bothered to fix. The gap where it should have been felt like a missing tooth, small but impossible not to notice. I touched the hangers around it, feeling the cold metal press into my fingers. He hadn't taken much, just what he needed, just enough to tell me this wasn't a momentary storm. This was something he had prepared for. The floor creaked behind me as I stepped back into the room. That sound held a memory, him entering late at night, boots in hand, trying not to wake me. I walked to the dresser, the one he sanded and stained himself years ago when money was tight. His old car keys lay there, the ones with the worn black fob and the dented metal tag. He hadn't used them in 2 years, not since we bought the newer car. Next to them, the small hook where the spare set usually hung was empty. He took the ones without the house key, the ones that wouldn't jingle too loud. My fingers hovered over the old keys, the metal cool against my skin when I finally picked them up. I turned them slowly, the faint scratch of the tag brushing my palm. He must have placed them here on purpose, a tidy gesture, a signal, or maybe a quiet apology. The dresser mirror caught my reflection from the side. Tired eyes, hair still loose from sleep, the kind of face that holds questions without asking them out loud. I stared at the empty hook beside the mirror and felt a small breath leave me, soft and hollow. The house felt bigger then, bigger than it ever had when the two of us lived inside it with all our routines stacked neatly on top of each other. My footsteps echoed lightly as I crossed the room, each one reminding me how few sounds were left to fill the space. There were mornings when Charles's cough would roll down the hallway before he even got out of bed. Mornings when he hummed while shaving without realizing he was doing it. All those small noises that shaped a life, gone before the sun had fully climbed the sky. I walked into the hallway, passing the framed picture of us from a trip we took years ago. He was smiling in that photo, not wide, not forced, just soft and genuine. The kind of smile that belonged to a man who believed in settling roots. I wondered if that version of him had known this morning would come, if he would have recognized the man who left a jacket-shaped gap in the closet. In the kitchen, the letter still sat on the table, folded neatly where I'd left it. I didn't reach for it this time. I just stood there, looking at it from the doorway, a thin piece of paper that felt heavier than the room surrounding it. My heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm of the fridge, humming, steady and unchanging. I could feel the silence filling the space between my breaths, pressing gently against my ribs. Not a threatening silence, not fear, something else. something more familiar, as if I'd known it long before today but hadn't dared to name it. It felt like recognition, not the sharp kind that arrives all at once, knocking the breath straight out of you. No, this was the slow kind, the kind that rises quietly from a place you've been ignoring. I walked my fingers along the edge of the table, stopping just short of the letter. He wanted me to find it. Maybe not immediately, but soon enough. The porch, the ink still drying, the jacket missing but not the rest of his clothes, the spare keys taken while the primary ones were left behind. He had wanted to leave footprints, subtle ones, but footprints all the same. I pulled out a chair and sat down, the wood sighing beneath me. My hand rested near the letter without touching it, close enough to feel the air shift around its presence. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle deeper. The memory of us arguing last month drifted in, our voices low, more tired than angry, a disagreement about nothing and everything. How even then he looked at the floor more than he looked at me, how his sighs at night grew longer, not the frustrated kind, the defeated kind. I opened my eyes again and glanced toward the window. The sun had risen higher, casting faint gold onto the countertop. Dust floated lazily in the beams of light, turning in slow circles like they had nowhere else to be. The world outside kept moving, indifferent to the way mine had shifted. I rose from the chair and walked back toward the bedroom, each step giving me a little more clarity than the last. The empty hanger in the closet, the missing spare keys, the letter on the porch, the silence in every room. He had chosen what to take and what to leave, and that choice carried its own kind of message, one softer than spoken words but clearer than anything he might have said. I stood in the center of the room, letting my gaze drift over the dresser, the bed, the open closet. My breath felt steadier now, though not lighter. The air held a faint chill, a reminder of the morning rain. I closed the closet gently, the latch clicking into place like a quiet punctuation. The house was still, so still it felt like time had paused, waiting for me to step into whatever came next. The truth hadn't arrived fully yet, but it was circling close, like a bird deciding when to land. I walked back toward the doorway, my hand brushing the frame as I passed, and as I stood at the edge of the hallway looking into the widening silence of the house, I realized something that settled into me with a quiet finality. He hadn't disappeared, not completely. He had left just enough for me to understand he meant for me to follow the trail, the jacket, the keys, the letter, pieces of a man halfway out the door. The morning air felt different when I stepped outside, colder than it should have been for that hour. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground still held the memory of it, soft and dark beneath my feet. A thin mist clung to the hedges, drifting slowly as if unsure where to settle. I closed the door behind me, hoping the quiet outside would loosen the tightness sitting in my chest. But the moment I took a step toward the yard, I saw her, Mrs. Finch, leaning against the fence with her elbows resting over the wood, her eyes already watching me, like she'd been waiting. She didn't say anything at first, just lifted her chin a little, the way people do when they're measuring how much truth you can handle before they speak. I could hear a bird somewhere in the pecan tree, chirping softly, unaware of how heavy the morning felt. Mrs. Finch shifted her weight and cleared her throat, and something in that small sound made me brace myself without even knowing why. "You up early today, Lorraine?" she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of concern and curiosity. "I heard a car leaving real slow around dawn. Thought maybe it was you." I tried to smile, but it didn't reach anywhere near my eyes. Wasn't me. My voice trembled just enough for her to notice. She didn't comment on it, but her eyebrows lifted a little, the way they always did when she sensed something brewing beneath a person's words. The mist moved between us like a thin veil, and for a moment, I wished it were thick enough to hide behind. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice like the whole neighborhood might be listening. "I saw Charles sitting in his truck last night, just sitting there. Engine off, lights off, staring at the house. The words hit me softly at first, like distant footsteps on a wooden floor. Then they settled deeper, bringing a slow ache with them. I felt my stomach tighten, the kind of tightening that happens when a truth you weren't prepared for starts moving toward you. I forced a small breath to steady myself, looking down at my hands so she wouldn't see the shift in my face. "He didn't come inside?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My voice came out quieter than I intended, almost a whisper the wind could have carried away. Mrs. Finch shook her head slowly. Not that I saw. Looked like he was thinking real hard about something, or remembering something maybe. The fence creaked as she rested more of her weight on it. She meant well. She always did. But her words felt heavy in the morning air, settling around us in a way I wasn't ready to sift through. The image formed in my mind too easily. Charles sitting in that old truck, hands on the steering wheel, watching the house, where we'd lived most of our married life. Watching me maybe, watching the windows, staring as though he was standing at the edge of something final. I swallowed, forcing another smile. It felt stiff on my face, like a mask that didn't quite fit. He probably just needed some air. You know how he gets sometimes. She didn't argue, but she didn't believe it either. Her silence stretched between us, warm and uncomfortable like a blanket pulled too tight. The mist was clearing now, revealing more of the yard, the porch, the spot where he must have stood earlier that morning. I couldn't look at it too long. It felt like staring into a doorway someone had just walked through without closing behind them. "You sure everything's all right?" Mrs. Finch asked gently. The softness in her voice almost undid me. Kindness has a way of hitting harder than any harsh word. I nodded a little too quickly, wrapping my arms around myself as if it were just the cold bothering me. "Just a strange morning, that's all." She hesitated, then gave a small nod, accepting my answer even if she didn't understand it. The wind shifted, brushing leaves across the driveway. I let my gaze follow them so I wouldn't have to meet her eyes, so I wouldn't have to acknowledge the worry sitting there. "All right, well, if you need anything," she said, stepping back from the fence, "you know where I am." I murmured a "thank you," watching her turn and walk toward her house. Her steps were slow, like she didn't want to leave me standing there alone. When she disappeared inside, the yard felt bigger, emptier. The world seemed to exhale in her absence, leaving me in a silence that felt too open. I walked toward the gate, resting my hand on the latch. The metal was cold, colder than the morning air. I looked out toward the street, imagining his truck creeping away at dawn, tires rolling softly, engine barely louder than a whisper, leaving slow so no one would wake, leaving slow so it wouldn't feel like running. But the part that sat heavier than anything Mrs. Finch had said was the night before. Him sitting there staring at the house, staring at me through the walls maybe, remembering, regretting, preparing. I leaned against the gate gently, the wood pressing into my shoulder. The quiet wrapped around me again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like something unspoken was taking shape, something I hadn't dared to acknowledge. Why didn't he come inside? Why watch from the truck instead of walking up the steps and opening the door? A memory surfaced before I could stop it. The night he stood in the kitchen, hands trembling near the sink, eyes fixed on the window instead of me. He'd said he was fine. But his fine had been thin that night, stretched like a piece of wire ready to snap. The sun was higher now, turning the mist into thin silver threads before they disappeared. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the light warm my face. Mrs. Finch's words replayed in my head. Him sitting in his truck, him staring at the house, him leaving real slow at dawn. Maybe he'd already said goodbye, just not with words. Maybe last night was him, standing at the edge of a decision he couldn't bring into the house with him. Maybe the letter wasn't written in the morning at all. Maybe it had been written in his eyes the night before. I opened the gate slowly, letting it swing outward. The hinges groaned, the sound long and tired. I stepped through and looked down the quiet street, still glistening from the night rain. Somewhere out there, He was driving away from the life we built, driving towards something I wasn't part of. Not yet. And as I stood there in the soft morning light, I felt it settle inside me like a quiet truth. He hadn't left suddenly. He'd been leaving for a long time. The sky looked washed out when I turned onto River Road, the kind of pale morning light that makes everything feel a little farther away than it is. The trees on either side still dripped from the night rain, beads of water sliding off the leaves and catching the light like small, trembling mirrors. My wipers brushed away the last of the mist on the windshield, but the heaviness inside me stayed. River Road had always been Charles's refuge, a place he went to clear the clutter in his mind. Driving it alone felt like trespassing on something private, something sacred to him long before this morning ever arrived. The road curved gently, following the flow of the water beneath the hill. I kept the windows cracked just enough to feel the cold air slip inside, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic. River water, old docks, rusted nails from forgotten summers. The tires hummed softly against the pavement, the sound steady and patient. My hands tightened on the steering wheel without me realizing it. Every mile I drove, I felt him more. Not beside me, not behind me, just ahead, like I was following the quiet trail of his absence. When I pulled into the small clearing near the dock, the gravel crunched under the tires, sharp in the stillness. The river stretched out before me, wide and calm, the surface rippling in long, slow lines. The dock looked older than I remembered. Planks darkened from years of rain, the posts leaning a little more toward the water. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling motor, the river moving somewhere below it all. This was where we used to come in the early years of our marriage, back when everything felt simple, in a way neither of us appreciated at the time. I stepped out of the car, the ground soft beneath my shoes. The air held a quiet that made every small sound louder, the rustle of branches, the distant call of a bird, the faint drip of water falling from tree to leaf to earth. I made my way toward the sand, my breath moving in slow, uneven waves. When I reached the edge where the sand met the grass, I stopped. There, pressed into the wet sand, was a footprint, fresh, deep, too big to be mine. My heart tightened, not in fear, but in something deeper. Recognition. He had been here, maybe not long before me, maybe watching the same river, standing in the same cold morning air. I crouched down slightly, tracing the outline of the print without touching it. The sand around it was still damp, not yet smoothed over by wind or water. It felt like an echo of him, left behind in the most honest way a man can leave anything, bare and unprotected. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter. The edges were starting to curl, the ink flaking in tiny specks where my thumb had pressed too many times. I held it gently, the paper softer now from being folded and unfolded, from being carried through halls and across rooms. I'd walked 100 times without ever noticing how empty they could feel. The river breeze brushed against the page, making it flutter lightly, like it wanted to lift itself out of my hands. Standing there, I felt the years between the early dock visits and this morning collapse into a single breath. I remembered us sitting on the edge of that old wood, our feet dangling above the water, Charles skipping stones with that smile he tried to hide behind his shoulder, the way he'd run his fingers along the grain of the dock as if reading some unspoken story written in the wood. We talked about nothing and everything, future plans, small fears, the way the river seemed to understand things better than people did. Now I found myself wondering what he was revisiting out here, a memory, a place where he once felt anchored, or something harder, a mistake he'd carried quietly, hidden under all the routines we built. Maybe something he thought this river could wash clean if he stood still long enough. I walked toward the dock slowly, each board beneath my feet groaning in that tired, familiar way. The river moved gently, brushing against the posts as if whispering to them. I stopped at the edge where we used to sit, the same spot where the wood bowed slightly under its own age. The footprint in the sand stayed within my view, a silent reminder that he had come here with purpose. Not wandering, not lost. Purpose. Holding the letter tighter, I stared at the river. It didn't offer answers. It never did. But it held the kind of stillness that makes you hear yourself louder. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, the weight of unspoken things rising behind my ribs. The question pressed into me with a steady ache. What brought him out here before dawn? What did he see in the water? What did he hope to leave behind? The wind shifted, lifting the ends of my hair. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze brush against my face. For a moment, I imagined him standing exactly where I was standing, his shoulders heavy, his breath uneven, his thoughts circling something he couldn't carry anymore. Maybe he watched the river the way he used to, like it could pull the truth out of him if he stared long enough. Maybe he thought this place could offer him a kind of mercy the house couldn't. When I opened my eyes, again the water was moving in gentle waves, slow and persistent. The letter fluttered again, the ink dusting off in tiny fragments. It felt fragile in my hands, not just because of the paper, but because of everything it held, everything he couldn't bring himself to say to my face. A heaviness settled in my chest, but not despair. Not yet. Something quieter, something more familiar. The feeling you get when you're standing on the edge of understanding, but the truth hasn't fully shaped itself. Not fear, recognition. I stepped back from the edge of the dock and walked toward the sand again, letting my gaze fall once more on the footprint. It was fading slightly now, the morning sun warming the surface. I knew the tide or the wind would erase it soon enough, but for this moment it was still here. A mark of a man caught between staying and leaving, a mark that felt like a message. I stood there for a long while, listening to the river, the trees, the soft whisper of the morning settling into itself. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath with me. When I finally turned to walk back to the car, I felt the letter shift in my hand, light and uncertain. And in that quiet walk across the wet sand, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. He wasn't just revisiting a place, he was retracing a path he'd taken once before, a path he might not be planning to return from. The diner sat low against the gray morning, its windows fogged from the warmth inside, pressing against the cold air outside. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door, half lit, humming the way it always had. I pulled into the small gravel lot and cut the engine, letting the silence settle around me. Steam rose from the pavement where the sun touched what was left of the night rain. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the familiar red door and the soft glow behind it. This was where Charles always came after nights he didn't want to explain. A plate of eggs, a cup of bitter coffee, and a silence only the early hours could hold. Walking toward it alone felt like stepping into one of his thoughts. The bell above the door chimed gently as I entered. The warmth hit me first, then the smell of coffee and old vinyl booths. The place was nearly empty, just 2 truckers at the far end and the soft clatter of dishes somewhere in the back. I slipped into the booth by the window, the one we used to sit in when our mornings ran long and we didn't want to go home just yet. My fingers brushed the edge of the table, tracing the small scratch he once made with his wedding ring when he laughed too hard. The room felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Janine walked out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. When her eyes landed on me, she paused, just for a second. But I saw it, that small flicker of hesitation, like she wasn't sure whether to smile or brace herself. She approached slowly, soft steps on the linoleum floor. "Well, morning, Lorraine," she said, her voice gentle but thinner than usual. "Haven't seen you in a bit." I nodded, offering a quiet smile. "It's been a morning." She didn't laugh, didn't even pretend to. She just pressed her lips together the way people do when they already know something isn't right. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded again, and she turned to fill the cup. I watched her hands, the way they trembled just slightly. Janine wasn't the nervous type. She had a steadiness about her, the kind worn into a person by long shifts and long years. When she returned and set the mug in front of me, she didn't walk away. She stayed there, holding the towel like she needed something to anchor herself. "He was here," she finally said, her voice low. The words settled between us like dust, light and heavy at the same time. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my palms. "Last night?" I asked. She nodded. Late. Later than I ever see him come in. Something in her face tightened, not with guilt, but with worry. She glanced toward the door as if checking whether someone else might walk in. The diner hummed softly. The coffee machine, the buzz of the sign, the quiet murmur of two men talking across the room. But around us, there was a pocket of silence that didn't belong to the place. "What did he say?" I asked. Janine looked down at the towel in her hands, twisting it slightly. "He was asking questions. Strange ones." My breath caught, just a little. "About what?" She hesitated, then lifted her eyes to mine. "Forgiveness." The word felt like a stone dropped into deep water. No splash, just a sinking, slow and certain. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. "He asked what I thought it meant for someone to start over," she said. "Said he didn't know if a person could do that, not without making things worse first." Her voice softened near the end, as if she wished she hadn't repeated it. I rested my elbows on the table, fingers touching the warm rim of the mug. His words echoed inside me, each one landing in a place I wasn't ready to examine yet. "Did he seem angry?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "Not angry, just tired." She placed a hand over her chest, lightly. "Not here," she said. "Here." I followed the motion, watching her palm settle above her heart. A different kind of tired, a weight no amount of sleep could fix. I thought of him sitting in his truck the night before, engine off, staring at the house. I thought of the sink, the unfinished coffee, the missing jacket. And now this. Him asking about forgiveness, as if it were a door he wasn't sure he deserved to walk through. "Did he say who he needed forgiveness from?" I asked softly. Janine shook her head. "No. He just said he'd been carrying something for a long time. Said it was catching up with him." Her words held a tremor. This time, not in her voice, but in the space between each sentence. She cared about him. Not in a way that threatened anything, just in the way people care about someone who's walked into their diner for years, leaving pieces of themselves in every half-finished cup of coffee. I sat back, the vinyl squeaking under me. My heart moved in slow, uneven beats. Forgiveness. Starting over. Carrying something. Each phrase pressed against me, one after another, until I could feel the shape of a truth forming. Something he hadn't been able to tell me. Something he had walked right up to but couldn't step into. Janine reached out and touched my arm lightly. "He looked worn, Lorraine. Not his body, his spirit." The words were soft, almost an apology. I nodded slowly, swallowing the tightness rising in my throat. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely holding steady. She squeezed my arm once, then returned behind the counter, giving me space that felt both generous and unbearable. I stared out the window, watching a drop of rain slide down the glass. It moved slowly, carving a path through the condensation, leaving a thin, wavering line behind it. The coffee in my mug had cooled, but I lifted it to my lips anyway. The bitterness settled on my tongue, grounding me. I thought about the river, the footprint, the missing jacket, the letter whose ink now flaked like old memories. Everything pointed in one direction. Something he couldn't carry anymore. Something he feared would break us, or had already broken him. I set the mug down gently, the porcelain clicking softly against the table. The sound felt final somehow, like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't fully read yet. The diner hummed back to life around me. Dishes clattering, footsteps crossing the floor, the faint laughter of someone in the kitchen, but inside me, something went quiet. Very quiet. As I stood to leave, the bell over the door chimed again, softer this time. The morning light had shifted, stretching longer shadows across the gravel. I walked slowly to the car, the cold air brushing my face like a question I couldn't answer yet. And as I sat behind the wheel, staring at the letter on the passenger seat, a realization settled over me like a shadow sliding into place. He wasn't asking about forgiveness, he was preparing for it. When I got back home, the house felt colder than the air outside. Not cold from temperature, but cold in that quiet, uneasy way a room feels when something inside it has already shifted. Light filtered through the curtains in thin, uneven lines, landing across the floorboards like little reminders of the morning passing without me. I stood in the entryway for a moment, letting the silence settle. It wasn't empty silence. It was full, as if every corner of the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice something I hadn't seen before. I walked slowly down the hallway, my hand brushing the wall the way people reach out in the dark even when they know the path by heart. I stopped at his study. The door half open, the way he always left it. The room was still. Dust floated in the slant of sunlight coming through the blinds. His desk sat in its usual place, papers stacked neatly, pen resting on the notepad where he always left half-written thoughts. But something felt off. A small shift in the air, a space that didn't belong to my memory of him. I stepped closer, letting my fingers trail across the desk's surface. Everything looked normal, but my eyes caught on the small wooden drawer on the right side. It was closed tighter than the others, the keyhole a tiny dark circle staring up at me. I pulled the handle gently. It didn't budge. Charles had never locked anything in this house. Not drawers, not cabinets, not even his old journal he kept tucked under the bed. The locked drawer felt louder than any raised voice could have been. I knelt beside the desk, checking the other drawers for a key, though I already knew it wasn't there. He wasn't careless enough to leave the answer so close to the question. I stood again, scanning the room slowly. My eyes landed on the wooden chair in the corner, the one he'd repaired last fall when the leg began to wobble. Something nudged my memory, a habit of his, a childhood trick he'd mentioned once about hiding things beneath what people never bothered to move. I turned the chair over, the legs pointing up like a small creature frozen mid-reach, and there it was, a piece of tape, folded over a small silver key, dusty around the edges. My breath caught a little when I peeled it free. The metal felt cold against my palm, colder than it should have been in a warm room. I walked back to the desk slowly, feeling each step in my chest. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, a sound that felt too loud in the stillness. I hesitated, my fingers resting on the handle. Opening it felt like stepping past something, like crossing a line he never meant for me to cross, or maybe one he'd hoped I eventually would. I pulled it open. The smell hit me first, paper, old wood, something faintly like dust warmed by time. Inside, the drawer was neatly arranged, not cluttered. A small stack of old photographs bound with a rubber band sat on the left. Next to them lay a handful of faded receipts, edges curling upward from age. And in the back, partially tucked beneath the photos, was a folded envelope. I reached for the photographs first. The rubber band snapped softly when I removed it. The pictures were old, the colors muted, the corners worn soft. Some were from years before I met him standing by a car I didn't recognize, him laughing with a group of people whose faces meant nothing to me, him in places he never mentioned, an unfamiliar lake, a dusty roadside, a small motel sign half cut off from the frame. There was a distance in his expression in some of them, like the camera had, caught him mid-thought, somewhere between where he stood and where he wanted to be. I set the photos down gently and picked up the receipts. Gas stations in towns I'd never heard him talk about, a diner in Tennessee, a motel in Kentucky, all dated years ago, but clustered close together. A stretch of time he'd never spoken about, a silence we'd both lived inside without knowing it. My gaze finally drifted to the envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges, the handwriting on the front, careful but unfamiliar. The name written across it was one I didn't recognize. Not family, not a friend, not anyone I'd ever heard him mention. The letters curved with intention, the way handwriting does when you're writing the same name often, when it means something. My fingers tingled as I lifted it. The weight of it felt heavier than the paper itself. I didn't open it. Not yet. Just holding it made the room feel colder, like a draft had slipped through the walls. I could hear my own breathing, soft and uneven. I set the envelope on the desk, letting my hand rest beside it. Why had he hidden another letter? And why this one, addressed to someone I didn't know? I took a slow breath, grounding myself. The quiet in the room shifted again, heavier this time, as if the answers weren't just hidden in the drawer, but in the spaces between everything he'd left behind. The locked drawer, the missing jacket, the letter on the porch, the footprint by the river, the questions in the diner, all of them pieces of a puzzle he hadn't trusted himself to assemble in front of me. I sat in his chair, letting it creak under my weight. My hands rested in my lap, fingers brushing the faint flakes of ink left on my skin from the first letter. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing the soft hum of the fridge down the hall, the distant tick of the living room clock. The house was full of tiny sounds, but each one felt muted, like they too were waiting. When I opened my eyes, the envelope was still there, pale against the dark wood. The name on the front seemed to watch me, quiet, patient, unavoidable. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths needed a steadier heart than the one beating in me. Instead, I slipped the envelope back into the drawer, leaving it unlatched this time, leaving it honest, leaving it waiting. The room felt colder still, as if something unseen had stepped into the space between me and the desk. And sitting there, with the drawer slightly open and the name lingering in my mind, I felt a soft tremor of realization move through me. Charles wasn't just hiding a part of his past, he was trying to keep it from becoming my present. The house was quiet again when I walked back into the study, as if it had folded itself neatly around the unanswered questions I'd left behind. The late morning light had shifted, landing across the desk in a soft golden line that made the drawer look smaller than it had before, almost innocent, but I felt the weight of it all the same. I stood there for a moment, letting my breath settle, letting the silence breathe around me. The envelope waited exactly where I'd placed it, pale and patient against the dark wood, holding a truth that had been hidden longer than our marriage. I sank slowly into his chair, the leather cool beneath me. My hands rested on the edge of the drawer, steady but not calm. I lifted the envelope again, feeling the thinness of the paper, the way the years had softened its corners. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably his, careful and deliberate, each letter touched with the same tenderness he used when writing my name. But this wasn't my name. This was someone I'd never heard of, someone who had lived quietly in the folds of his past, Eleanor. The name felt unfamiliar on my tongue, though I didn't speak it aloud. There was a curve in the E that he never used with me, a softness in the letters that made something in my chest tighten unexpectedly. I slipped my thumb under the flap and opened it slowly, the glue long since brittle. The paper inside unfolded with a delicate sigh, the creases worn soft from being opened and closed more times than I could guess. The ink was yellowed, the edges faintly frayed, as if the letter had lived many years in the dark. I began to read. The first few lines were gentle. Not the way a man writes to a stranger, but the way he writes to someone who once held his heartbeat in their hands. His words weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were simple, truthful in a way that made my throat close. He wrote about missing her, about leaving too quickly, about a promise he made, and broke. Each sentence felt like a small stone dropping quietly into a still pond inside me, the ripples spreading wider with each line. My eyes slowed as I read, absorbing not just the words, but the spaces between them. Regret, distance. A longing he had never named in our years together, a grief older than our marriage. Eleanor. A name he had carried quietly, a story he had tucked away beneath the life we built. A woman who had existed in his heart long before I took up space there. The room felt colder suddenly, though the sunlight still warmed the desk. I held the letter gently, careful not to tear the already fragile paper. He wrote about wanting forgiveness, about hoping she wouldn't think he'd forgotten her. He wrote about wanting to start over with her, about a day he swore he'd come back, a day he never kept. I paused, letting my eyes drift from the page to the wall across from me, the paint soft and familiar. For a moment, it felt like the room tilted, like the house had shifted subtly under the weight of a truth settling into place. This wasn't a love letter, not anymore. It was an echo, a ghost of something unfinished in him. My fingers tightened around the paper. I didn't feel jealousy. Not exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter. The realization that a part of him had always been looking backward, even when he faced me. That he had carried an old ache the way some people carry a scar. Faint, but always there, waiting for the right light to show itself. I read on. He apologized to her, more deeply than he ever apologized to me, for disappearing, for choosing a different life, for breaking a promise he had no right to make. He wrote about distance, not miles, but years, how time had changed him, how he feared reaching out because he didn't know if she'd remember him with warmth or resentment, how every now and then something would remind him of her. A song, a place, the sound of rain on the roof, and he'd feel that same heaviness rush back in. The words blurred slightly, not from tears, but from the ache pressing behind my eyes. I blinked slowly, steadying myself. I looked around the room again. The framed photographs on the wall, the books he'd read and reread, the small wooden clock ticking quietly, all of it familiar, all of it now shadowed by the presence of a name I'd never heard. I read the last paragraph slowly. He wrote that he wished he could look her in the eye and tell her the truth, that she deserved that much, that he was sorry in a way that didn't fade with time, that if she ever wanted closure, real closure, she only had to ask. But the letter had never been sent, and now it sat in my hands. I folded it carefully, pressing the worn creases back into place. My hands rested on it for a long moment, the paper warm from my touch. The house hummed faintly around me, the distant refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock, the wind brushing against the siding outside, life moving forward, even while I felt suspended between then and now. Was Eleanor the reason he left? Was he chasing a past, or trying to outrun the pieces of himself he couldn't bear to let me see? I placed the letter back on the desk, smoothing it gently. A small part of me wanted to close the drawer again, to tuck it all away the way he had, but I couldn't. The truth was open now, breathing, and so was the ache that came with it. The room felt colder as I sat back, the edge of the desk pressing lightly against my fingertips. I let my eyes fall to the name written in his careful hand. Eleanor, a stranger, a memory, a key to a door I never knew existed. And as I sat there in the fading quiet of the afternoon, something settled in my chest with a soft, profound certainty. He wasn't just running from something. He was running toward someone. Night settled slowly over the house, stretching itself across the walls like a long shadow. The light outside softened into that deep blue color that comes just before darkness fully settles in. I moved through the rooms quietly, turning off lamps one by one, as if dimming the house might calm whatever was stirring inside me. The silence felt different now, not empty but alert, like the house itself was listening. By the time I reached the bedroom, the sky outside the window had slipped into darkness. the kind that sits heavy on the roof and makes every small sound feel louder than it should be. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting in my lap, the day still buzzing faintly under my skin. The hidden drawer, the letter to Eleanor, the weight of a name I'd never heard. My breath moved slow and uneven, the way it does when a truth has settled too close to the surface. The ceiling fan above me hummed gently, its blades cutting through the warm air in steady circles. I focused on that sound, letting it steady me, letting it fill the spaces my thoughts kept trying to rush into. That was when the phone rang. A sharp, sudden sound cutting through the quiet like a small crack in thin ice. I reached for it quickly, more instinct than thought, the screen glowing in the dim room. Unknown number. The digits meant nothing, but the feeling that rose in me did. My breath caught, suspended between fear and recognition. Before I could press accept, the phone went silent. The screen dimmed. The room grew still again. I stared at the dark screen, my heartbeat pressing softly but insistently against my ribs. Unknown number, the kind of call people make when they don't want to be traced, or when they aren't sure they should be calling at all. I swallowed, pressing redial with a hand that wasn't steady. The call didn't connect. Not even a ring. Just silence, cold and immediate. I let the phone fall gently onto the blanket beside me, my fingers still curled as if I were holding something fragile. The hum of the ceiling fan returned, but it didn't feel grounding anymore. It felt distant. The room around me seemed to shift slightly, as if leaning in closer. I sat there, breathing slowly, listening to the quiet. The phone hadn't rung all day, not once. But now, in the middle of the night, it called twice from a number that didn't want to be known. A quiet intuition settled into my chest, spreading slowly, not sharp, but sure. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it settle into me. It had everything to do with him. My hands tightened slightly on the blanket, gathering the fabric between my fingers. I didn't need proof. I didn't need logic. I didn't need anything more than the quiet pull in my gut. The same pull that had followed me since sunrise. He was out there somewhere, moving, thinking, carrying something heavy enough to make him leave letters behind and drive down old roads in the dark. And now, maybe, reaching back. The phone lit up again, not ringing this time, just the screen brightening as if waking from sleep. I looked at it quickly, heart jumping. But it was only the time glowing across the display. 11:04 p.m. Nothing more. I exhaled shakily, lowering my gaze. The ceiling fan hummed on, steady and indifferent. I listened to it, trying to match its rhythm, trying to slow the thoughts spinning, inside my head. But the unanswered call played over and over, a loop I couldn't turn off. Was he trying to reach me, or was he trying to say goodbye? The question settled deep, deeper than anything I'd asked myself today. My breath caught again, softer this time, like something inside me didn't want to be heard. I stood, pacing slowly to the window. The night outside was still, thick with quiet. No headlights on the street, no breeze brushing the trees. Just darkness and the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me. I pressed my hand lightly against the cool glass. The day had been full of signs. Small ones, quiet ones, like breadcrumbs from a story he hadn't finished telling. The letter he left on the porch, the missing jacket, the footprint by the river, the hidden envelope addressed to Eleanor, and now this call, appearing briefly and then slipping back into silence. I wondered where he was, if he was alone, if he was scared, if his hands were shaking as much as mine. I turned away from the window and sat back on the bed, pulling the blanket around my shoulders, even though the room was warm. My phone lay beside me, screen dark again, still, waiting. The silence around it felt unnerving, like something paused mid-sentence. I picked it up slowly, scrolling to the call log. 2 missed calls, no voicemail, no name, just that blank phrase, unknown number, staring back at me. I touched the screen lightly, tracing the words the way I'd traced his handwriting earlier. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had moved closer without making a sound. My thoughts drifted to his voice, soft when he was unsure, steady when he was ready to confess something he'd been holding too long. I imagined him on the other end of that call, breathing into the phone, trying to gather the courage to speak, or maybe trying to hear my voice one last time without risking a conversation he didn't know how to start. The ache in my chest deepened, spreading slow like ink in water. Not sharp, not sudden, just quietly consuming. I lay back on the bed, the ceiling fan turning above me in slow, patient circles. The hum filled the room again, steady as rain. My phone rested on my chest, rising and falling with my breath. Unknown number, unknown truth, unknown goodbye. The night stretched long and still around me, the quiet thick enough to almost touch. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft pulse in my ears, the low whirl of the fan, the silence of a phone that no longer rang. And somewhere in that darkness, in that thin line between waiting and knowing, a realization settled gently, like a whisper, brushing the edge of my mind. He wasn't reaching out because he was lost. He was reaching out because he was leaving. The morning light was thin when I pulled into the old church lot, the sun barely pushing through the low clouds hanging over the steeple. The gravel crunched under my tires in that familiar, uneven way. The sound, carrying farther than it should in the quiet. I sat for a moment with the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the silence inside the car settle around me. The church stood still and small against the gray sky, its white paint chipped from years of weather, the wooden steps darkened from last night's rain. Charles used to come here on the days he couldn't put his thoughts anywhere else. I used to believe that meant he was finding peace. Now I wasn't sure what he'd been searching for. The air was cool when I stepped outside, brushing against my arms, the breeze carrying the faint smell of wet earth and old wood. The church door was locked, the windows dim. I walked slowly along the side of the building, my shoes sinking slightly into the softened ground. Behind the church, the gravel road stretched out like a thin, forgotten path. I remembered the first time he told me about the shed tucked back there. An old place he used to retreat to long before he knew me. A place he said helped him breathe clearer. I hadn't thought about it in years, but today the memory felt pulled to the surface, asking to be followed. I walked down the gravel road, the stones shifting beneath my feet, the trees leaning in as if listening. The air felt thick in a quiet way, holding a kind of stillness that made every heartbeat feel louder. When I reached the clearing, the shed stood there exactly as I remembered it, leaning slightly to one side, its metal roof rusted in patches, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Time had worn it thin, but something about it felt alive, like it had been disturbed recently. I stepped closer, noticing the muddy footprints just outside the door. They weren't mine. They were heavier, deeper, fresh. My breath hitched softly, more from recognition than fear. He had been here, maybe only hours before. The door groaned softly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing inside the small, shadow-filled space. The smell hit me first, damp wood, old dust, and something faintly like smoke. A half-burned match lay near the entrance, the tip blackened, the wood still faintly scented with the sharp tang of something recently lit. I crouched slightly, touching the edge of it with my fingertips. It hadn't been there long. The air around it told me that much. Inside, the shed was dim. Light filtered through the cracks in the walls, thin, pale strands cutting across the floor in soft diagonal lines. The room was nearly empty. Just an old stool in the corner and a few scattered tools rusted from age. But on the floor near the stool sat a torn piece of paper, its edges jagged, the ink smudged in places. My pulse quickened as I stepped toward it. The handwriting was familiar before I even bent down. The same careful script from the letter he left on the porch, the same pressure in the strokes. I picked it up gently, the paper softer than I expected, worn from being folded and unfolded. across the torn page. The words were brief, uneven, as if he'd written them in a moment of urgency. Finally telling her the truth. The rest of the sentence had been ripped away. The part I needed was missing, torn off and taken with him. I held the fragment in my hand, feeling the tremble in my fingers as the words settled deeper into me. The truth. My breath grew shallow. My mind reached instinctively toward Eleanor, the letter hidden in his drawer, the name that had cracked open a part of his past I never knew existed. But something in the way the words were written, urgent, unfinished, made my stomach twist. This wasn't just about Eleanor. This was something heavier, older, something he had been circling all day, leaving traces of himself in places he once hid from the world. I stepped back toward the doorway, letting the cooler air brush my face. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, their branches shifting like they were whispering. I looked down at the paper again, my eyes tracing the ink as if they could force meaning out of the missing parts. Finally telling her the truth. The letters dipped slightly at the end, the pen lifting abruptly, the sentence cut off. It felt like he hadn't just torn the page, but had pulled himself away from whatever he'd been trying to confess. I sat on the small step outside the shed, gripping the paper between both hands. The gravel road lay still behind me, stretching back toward the church. The shed felt like a place where truths got tangled, buried or abandoned. I thought of him sitting on that stool, head bowed, match burning in his hand. Maybe he'd tried to burn the paper. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe the truth itself frightened him enough to leave it half-written and flee before it could swallow him whole. The wind shifted suddenly, scattering a small drift of dry leaves across the clearing. They moved with a soft, shuffling sound, brushing against my shoes before settling again. The world felt suspended for a moment, as if waiting for me to catch up to what my heart already understood. I looked at the torn page again. The truth. His truth. Not just about Eleanor, though she was part of it. No, this felt like something deeper, something older than both of us, something that had been pressing against him for years, shaping quiet moments, stretching the space between us, pushing him toward the river, the diner, the church, and finally here, a shed that held his old ghosts. My throat tightened as I folded the paper gently, slipping it into my pocket. The weight of it felt small, but the truth behind it pressed heavy against my ribs. I stood slowly, looking back at the shed one last time. The open door swayed slightly in the breeze, as if breathing, as if waiting for someone to return and finish what had been started, but he was already gone. I turned toward the gravel road, my footsteps crunching softly as I began walking back toward the church. The sky above had shifted into a deeper gray, the kind that felt like the pause before a storm. As I reached the edge of the clearing, a realization washed over me with the quiet certainty of something long overdue. Whatever truth he had been trying to confess, it wasn't just about who he once loved, it was about who he really was. Dusk settled across the yard like a soft blanket, the kind that dims the edges of everything without fully taking the light away. The sky held on to the last streaks of gold and violet as I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickering on as if it sensed me before I stepped out of the car. The air felt heavier than it had that morning, touched by the weight of everything I'd found. The shed, the torn page, the match that still smelled faintly of smoke. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long moment, letting the quiet rise around me, letting it fill the space he'd left behind. The letter waited where I'd left it, resting on the small table beside the rocking chair, its edges curled slightly from the day's humidity. I picked it up gently, the paper cool now, no longer holding the warmth of the morning. The porch boards creaked softly beneath me as I sat down. The house seemed to exhale, settling into a silence that held more questions than comfort. I unfolded the letter slowly this time, smoothing it with the flat of my hand. The ink looked darker in the dim light, the strokes uneven, the curves rushed. I began to read again, letting each word move through me the way water moves through dry soil. Slowly, quietly, filling places I hadn't realized were empty. The apology hit me first, the same way it had that morning, but deeper now. Not just a sorry for leaving, not just a sorry for the silence. It was the kind of apology a person gives when they finally understand the cost of their own hiding. I read the next lines, softer now, the ones where he admitted fear. Fear of telling me something he should have spoken years ago. Fear of losing the life we'd built by revealing the truth of who he used to be. Fear of the look he imagined I might give him. Not anger, but disappointment. The porch light buzzed faintly, catching a moth circling the bulb. I traced the curve of his handwriting, noticing the tiny tremors in the lines. He had written this quickly, too quickly to steady himself, too quickly to think. I imagined him standing right where I was sitting, the ink bottle open, the paper trembling under his hand, his breath uneven, the sky beginning to lighten, running out of time. And suddenly, the meaning behind the wet ink struck me like a quiet blow to the ribs. He hadn't prepared this letter days ago. He hadn't tucked it away for the right moment. He wrote it right before leaving, moments before, maybe seconds. Standing on this very porch, torn between staying and running, his heart dragging him in both directions. I pressed my thumb lightly against the bottom of the page, where the last line curved downward. The ink smudged beneath my skin, a soft blur spreading across the paper like a slow bruise. I felt something inside me loosen. Not relief, not pain exactly, but recognition. He wasn't running from me. Not fully. He was running from the truth he'd carried so long it had changed the shape of him. I leaned back in the rocking chair, letting it move gently beneath me, the evening breeze brushing my face. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every memory feel closer. The hum of a distant car, a dog barking faintly down the street, the crickets starting their slow chorus, all of it wrapped around me as I read the letter again, slower this time, letting every word settle in its own space. He wrote that he loved me. He wrote that he was grateful. But he also wrote that gratitude wasn't the same as honesty. And he didn't know which truth would hurt me more, the one he'd hidden or the one he was still carrying. The rocking chair creaked, rocking forward and back, the rhythm soft enough to settle my breath. The years between us rose quietly. The dinners eaten in silence, the late nights he stayed on the porch without explaining why, the mornings he looked tired even after a full night's sleep. I'd told myself it was stress, work, age. But now, the patterns aligned in a way I couldn't ignore. We'd been living with silence long before today. Silence between sentences. Silence in the way he held himself. Silence in the way I didn't ask enough questions. The letter trembled slightly in my hands, though the breeze had died down. I looked out across the yard, the last of the daylight slipping behind the trees. The world felt paused, as if waiting for me to catch the thought forming slowly in my chest. This wasn't just about Eleanor, it wasn't just about the shed, or the torn page, or the call that rang twice and said nothing. This was about the life we'd built on top of things unsaid, things buried, things we both feared to disturb. I let the letter fall gently into my lap, the smudged corner catching my eye again. The house behind me hummed softly, waiting. I thought about him writing that final line, the ink still wet when he placed it on the porch. I thought about him standing in the doorway, torn between knocking and walking away. I thought about the truth he couldn't finish writing, even on the torn page he left behind, and I thought about what it would mean when he returned. If he did. If he walked back up these steps. If he looked me in the eye. If he held the rest of the truth in his hands. Would I be ready to hear it? All of it? The parts that scared him. The parts he wasn't proud of. The parts that reshaped everything I thought I knew. I folded the letter again slowly, pressing the crease with my thumb. The ink shimmered faintly where it had smudged, catching the last bit of light. The porch felt still. The world felt still. And I felt the weight of the question settle gently inside me, quiet but undeniable. When he returns, if he returns, will I be ready to hear the rest?